Hi, everybody. This is Non-Duality Talk for November 19th, 2015. I'm Jerry Katz. My guest is Dr. Ravi Ravindra, whose website is ravindra.ca. Ravi Ravindra is Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where for many years he was a professor in the departments of Comparative Religion, Philosophy, and Physics. If that's not enough, anything else you were a professor of, Dr. Ravindra? That's enough for anyone, I think.
I did end up teaching courses even in theater, actually, one
In
year.
theater, really? Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that would be connected with your Gurdjieff work, I guess.
No, it was actually a course they asked me to give on the theater and the sacred.
Really?
Yeah. Because there are Grotowski, you may know of, a very well-known theater director, and Peter Brook and Andrei Serban, these three. I have known two of them actually personally, and I attended a workshop by Grotowski. So they all try to really approach the sacred through their theater. For example, Peter Brook has done all kinds of remarkable things on the Mahabharata, etc. So the theater department invited me to give a course for a year, for one course.
How was that to put that together? Was that kind of a surprise for you, or did you enjoy that? Or
no, I quite enjoyed it. It was rather nice to see what some of the modern theater directors are trying and doing. As I said, two of them I know, actually. I have known them personally. And so it was good to explore their... That's not what I usually do. So it was good to explore something new.
Well, you talk a lot. You give a lot of talks. And how much of your work is theater? I mean, you have to communicate, right? You have to get across what you want to get across.
In a way, that is true. All talking is slightly a kind of a performance, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not like they introduce you and you come out with a big smile, and you're.
Yeah.
It's not like you're doing Vegas.
Yeah.
And just to continue your introduction, you were a member of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, a fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla, and I might need help pronouncing some of these words.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Founding director of the Threshold Award for Integrative Knowledge, and you were a member of the Board of Judges for the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion. That's pretty serious.
Yeah.
And honorary member of the Scientific and Medical Network and a fellow of the Temenos Academy in England.
Temenos.
They pronounce Academy in England. I never heard of that. What is that? What is the Temenos Academy?
Well, that academy was initially set up by the English poetess, I keep forgetting her name, Kathleen Rain. And they are very interested in what are the essential aspects of the traditions. And the Prince of Wales is its actually patron, and they even actually teach some courses under that, but usually to do with spiritual concerns in the great traditions. That is their main concern. And they have about 20, maybe 22 fellows throughout the world. And I was rather intrigued to be invited to be a fellow. So I end up giving some talks there occasionally. If I'm in England, they almost always invite me to speak there.
And of course, that's part of your background, your deep immersion in the teachings of the Hindu and Christian traditions.
So. Yes, one can hardly not be aware of the great traditions, and if you have really any spiritual interest, one is naturally drawn to subtle teachings in any tradition, although naturally it's not easy to be familiar with many of these, simply because there is so much a matter of the language and so much delicacy. And then, of course, all teachings have been usually practically ruined by the organized religion and the churches because they mold them in some direction, largely to do with what will benefit the church rather than what will help the spiritual search.
Now, what then leads a person right to the core then of a religion and kind of cuts through all of that, the organized, the religious stuff, and like you said, the language barriers. And
yes, well, what leads a person really is, my own impression is, Jerry, that there is only one single requirement for any human being, which may sound rather odd, but I often say all that one needs is to take oneself seriously. In a manner of speaking, we take ourselves too seriously all the time. But when I say that, to take oneself seriously, then naturally I would wonder, what am I? Where did I come from? And when my body dies, as it naturally will die, is that the end? Does anything survive? So you see what I'm saying? If I take myself seriously, these questions become absolutely obvious. And then if I realize, and this can be, one can be drawn to it from scientific knowledge or just general cultural knowledge. Scientific knowledge is disseminated widely in the culture. And just to realize that the universe is so vast that, thousands of galaxies are appearing and disappearing as we are talking. And we live in a very average galaxy among billions of galaxies. And even they are not at the center of the galaxy, we are around a peripheral star. Then one becomes aware that, my goodness, in this vastness, for a few decades, a little chunk of matter has been made coherent enough by extremely intricate and delicate laws. In my case, to be called Ravi, in your case, to be called Jerry. But this is all only for a few decades. And then the question naturally arises, oh my goodness, why does the universe take the trouble to create me for a few decades? My own impression is, if one has any sense of the vastness of the universe and any appreciation for the delicate laws that are running the whole universe, one doesn't have to be a researching scientist to be interested in these things. Then one is naturally going to take one's own temporary sojourn in this body rather seriously. And one would therefore naturally be drawn to what we call spiritual concerns. The word can itself lead to trouble for some people. But this is just part of our cultural problem, that certain whole areas have been dismissed because we want everything to be understood at our own level by our ordinary minds. Whereas the very word spiritual by definition means something subtler than the body and the mind. So there we are. To enter that subtlety really primarily requires awareness that there is something subtler than my mind. And therefore, if you read the instructions in any of the mystical traditions, by which I don't mean the usual religious traditions, but for example, the standard classical texts of yoga, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, for example, or the Bhagavad Gita, or read within the Christian tradition, John of the Cross as an example, or Meister Eckhart, any of the great mystics, then one realizes that the mind needs to become quiet, because otherwise it just keeps adding its own noise. We have a very classical image of this actually in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, that the mind needs to be purified, refined, cleansed, so that it will be like a perfectly clear diamond. Wherever it is placed, it will reflect the object without introducing any coloration of its own. So it's not that one is against the mind. Far from it. The mind actually needs to be cleansed, to be purified. But in all of these spiritual traditions, the mind is not the knower any more than the microscope is the knower. but I can look through a microscope and know something. And then more refined or better the microscope, more desirable knowledge can be obtained. So far from being against the mind, one needs to actually cleanse and purify the mind. But the real seeing, the word is better to use the word seeing rather than knowing. It's almost a definition of a sage, really. A sage says what he sees, not what he thinks, not what he has read, not what he has derived from some data, etc. So, clear perception, but perception of a still mind. That is the direction to aim at, but that is easier said than done, because all the time we are so flooded with information. You probably know this very sad, rather a sad poem of T.S. Eliot, a long time ago. Where is the wisdom that is lost in knowledge, and where is the knowledge that is lost in information? And we teach our kids to enter into these quizzes about trivial pursuits, this information, that information. That is completely contrary to stilling the mind. That's the direction that is needed.
Let me ask you about what I'll call non-duality culture, or non-duality as a spiritual phenomenon. Do you see non-duality it's become a common word only in the last 15 or 20 years, and there's sort of a culture around it.
Yeah, but in India you'll find this in the earliest Veda, the oldest text in any Indo-European language. So,
yes, Advaita.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, what do you think of non-duality in the West as it's emerged in the last 15 or 20 years?
Well, one has to be very careful that serious issues don't get cheapened. For example, I give this only as an example. I think search for non-duality is a very serious matter. But we can latch on to some cliches. For example, personally, I find it both amusing and actually slightly nauseating to see slogans like Om is equal to MC square. Okay. Which is one of the big things. This conference on non-duality and science. And
why is it slightly nauseating, to use your words? It bothers you in some way, or you just talk about that then. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, well, MC square, as you well know, is one of the equations from the special theory of relativity of Einstein, trying to describe the relationship between matter and energy. Now, Om is, one could say, people often say it's a sound, primordial sound, but it's really a primordial vibration which can only be experienced, one may even use the word heard, but it's really nothing to do with ordinary ears, any more than Christ's remark about you have eyes but you do not see has to do with ordinary eyes. It is to do with a whole experiencing this subtle vibration which is at the very root of the origin of the whole manifested universe and even beyond. Now, to sort of equate these, what does it mean? The only people who either don't know what MC square stands for or Om stands for can possibly do this.
Well, that sounds like an artistic or literary way of showing that the conference involves both consciousness, which might be the Om part, and science, which would be the MC squared part. So I don't know, isn't there an artistic validity to it?
Well, I think maybe I'm just a little too concerned about the real value of these expressions. One hardly needs to be against science or against spirituality. You could hardly accuse me of that in my personal case. But I just find these things rather cheapening, really, more than anything else. That's why it bothers me. But those who are not bothered by it can obviously happily use it. I'm hardly creating censorship here. People obviously use it.
So do you find that some of the modern culture of non-duality in the West is setting up forms of distraction then?
I think so.
Yeah.
Because what that does, it ends up implying that keep doing science and then you'll get to non-duality. We have already gotten there, which is you can do any amount of science, you're not going to get any experience of non-duality. Because the whole underlying fundamental assumption of science, not only science, of philosophy also, is that the mind can figure these things out. Whereas what we are saying, as I already said, that the whole underlying notion of any of the sages in the history of humanity, they don't have to be only from India. I just already gave you 2 examples from the Western sages. Or you can take Rumi, if you like, from the Sufi tradition. They are insisting that the mind needs to be quietened, that this is something which is subtler than the mind. And these kinds of slogans like E is equal to mc squared, so you happily read special theory of relativity or physics, then you have figured this out. It almost an attempt as if spirituality can be made into a branch of physics, which I find that's completely odd against entire teaching of all the sages in the history of humanity.
I was just noticing the nature of how you respond to a question. And
Yes.
I can understand why you're invited to speak around the world. You just were visiting Britain and Switzerland and India and Norway, and you travel and you speak.
Well,
and the nature of your responses are very holistic. You cover a lot in order to answer a question.
well, I don't think any serious question can be just a matter of yes or no. I think, actually, in fact, if you're interested, I would very much like us to slightly go back to a very fundamental philosophical issue, which is, maybe let me just remind you and your listeners of the famous Western philosopher Immanuel Kant. One of his most important books is called The Critique of Pure Reason, in which he actually concluded that knowledge as we have it through the mind, he was specifically thinking of scientific knowledge, can never be purely objective, simply because whatever it tries to study, of course, that object gives some information, but that the mind, in the process of gathering knowledge, introduces its own categories of thought. He spoke about 12 categories of thought. Offhand, I can quickly mention to you, like space, time, causality, quantity, etc. Which is to say, he concluded that we cannot have any knowledge through the mind, through thinking, that can be free of categories of time, space, etc. And all scientific laws that we have invariably involve some mention of time. Whereas this whole business of non-duality, if this has any meaning from the spiritual point of view, has to do with eternal perception, which are not against time, but they are free of time. And they are free of thought, which is why in spiritual knowledge, we may or may not buy this idea because of our contemporary scientific mindset. But what the spiritual sages are aiming at is a completely objective knowledge, whereas scientific knowledge cannot be completely objective. It's, if you like, its main virtue of scientific knowledge is that it is intersubjective, that it's not just a matter of my thinking something or my deciding something, other scientists who are suitably competent or are qualified can also check it. But in spiritual domain, the whole emphasis is on completely objective knowledge so that the subject is totally out of the way. Another way of saying that is spiritual knowledge, which leads to a great freedom, is not freedom for myself. It is freedom from myself. This is extremely important thing to appreciate. You can read any of the great sages, Rumi, for example, or John of the Cross, or Meister Eckhart, or Shankara, or Nagarjuna, or Buddha, or Christ, any of them. What then are we getting at? What we are getting at is, how can I be out of the way? Until I am out of the way, including all my scientific and philosophic knowledge, then I cannot come to this experience of the vastness which is eternal and which is the only thing that the sages say is non-dual. So this is the reason why, if we are going to try to make this kind of experience as a branch of physics, which is what the kind of implication is of many of these conferences and these slogans that I talked about, then you can see where my uneasiness comes from.
Is there any kind of a movement of science to consider consciousness itself? I believe I did read something that there may be some movement of within science to consider the scientist, who is doing the science.
Yeah.
Do you see any movement towards that, or is it even much worthwhile? I mean, how far can it go?
It can go far, but one of the things which is very important to appreciate, what scientists say is not the same thing as what science says. Einstein can make quite remarkable statements about human nature, about the meaning of life, about what science is about, but none of that is a part of his scientific publication. It's very important to understand this, because, of course, generally we pay attention only to the great scientists like Newton or Einstein or Darwin, because the other guys are just trying to somehow buttress themselves by using something from science. These guys, like Newton and Einstein, I simply give these only as an example. You can take any other great scientist, Niels Bohr, Schrödinger. What they say is not something that is published in their scientific papers. So there it is very important for us to appreciate this, that one can be, of course, very interested in consciousness. If we are going to approach this rigorously according to modern scientific principles, it means we ought to be able to explain the phenomena, any phenomena, whatever we are studying, in terms of matter in motion, which is why physics has been the queen of the sciences for the last 400 years, because that is its main project. It studies matter in motion. And all the major revolutions in physics, quantum mechanics, relativity theory, have to do with either redefining what is matter, understanding differently, more subtly, or what is motion, because motion requires both space and time in it. So, space, time, matter, energy, that is what naturally creates a revolution in physics, if there is a radical new understanding of any one of these things. And we have had some very remarkable revolutions. Quantum mechanics and relativity theory are good examples of this. So, but if things are going to be explained in terms of matter in motion, which is a fundamental assumption of modern science, that everything has to be explained in terms of lower and lower things. Matter is the ultimate reality, which is completely devoid of any consciousness. So I must explain consciousness in terms of unconsciousness, something totally unconscious. This is how life began. Somehow the material particles come together, life began, then somehow intelligence came, somehow we can talk about consciousness. So it's not that the scientists are not interested in this. What I'm saying is that scientists are also human beings before they are doing science or anybody doing art or doing anything. After all, we're talking about human beings. Then, if one is willing to allow that consciousness is primary from which other things emerge, including matter, which is at the root of all spiritual tradition. Just to simply remind you of something absolutely obvious, all manifested universe, according to the spiritual traditions, begins from on high. By on high, I mean the greatest level of consciousness. Whether you call it God or call it Brahma or call it Holy Spirit or Allah or just simply that. It doesn't matter what label you attach to it, but what is common to all of those labels is that they have the highest level of consciousness. Whereas according to the scientific mindset, by which I mean only modern science, that doesn't apply to ancient Chinese science or ancient Indian science or ancient Greek science. But according to modern science, beginning with mostly with Galileo, who is said to be the father of modern physics, quite rightly, there everything begins from the lowest level of consciousness, from completely dead matter. So if we are insisting that we must explain everything, including consciousness, in terms of matter in motion, so then consciousness has to be derived from the brain, then this is already problematic. On the other hand, can there be any understanding of mind or consciousness which is independent of the brain? Can spirit exist without the body? Which is absolutely the fundamental assumption of all the sages in the history of humanity. So what we are talking about is not that scientists are not interested in consciousness. Sure, it'll be an absolutely dumb human being who's not interested in consciousness. But this doesn't make it science. For it to be science according to the contemporary mindset, we must explain consciousness in terms of matter in motion, which then is already reducing it to something. Maybe one of these centuries, physics will become a branch of real psychology. That would be actually giving importance to consciousness.
In the field of psychology, there are some psychotherapists who tend to work from, or tend to use presence, what they call presence, as a tool, a way of meeting their client.
I agree. So all of this actually exists. If you and I are talking to each other, especially if we meet face to face, we can speak from a presence, we can speak from a feeling of love, we can speak from a feeling of gratitude. We don't have to simply look at the image of somebody sitting there and taking pictures and photographs and wondering how much do they weigh. That is not the only concern. However, these very people, these psychotherapists that you just mentioned, they would not be called rigorous scientific psychologists. For the simple reason, because rigorous scientific psychologists would try to study through rats or pigeons some stimulus and what is the reaction or response to that. That is what we would call rigorous science. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. So a psychologist can come from presence, but a scientist who's studying something would be hard to come from presence, other than as a, like you say, as a human being.
That's right. No, which is why I'm actually saying something fairly obvious, but hardly anybody seems to see it. What scientists say is not the same thing what science says. That doesn't mean that science is wrong. I'm far from it. Within its own assumptions, science has done quite remarkable things. All our technology is being driven by science now. But so are all our atomic bombs. In a way, it's quite ironic, really, that there is a correlation between the number of atomic bombs and the number of Nobel laureates in a country. That needs to be somewhat seriously considered. Why? If we are really speaking about non-duality, that at the root, you and I and every creature emerges from or arises from the same energy, same source. Would we be really destroying each other as we are doing? 20th century, which saw the greatest number of Nobel Prize winners in any field, especially in USA, is also the century which saw the greatest mayhem in terms of killing, wars, etc. And are we stopping that now? What is going on just these very days? What happened in Paris 4 days ago? So you can see all this emphasis on technology and science and trying to figure out everything in terms of matter in motion. Well, that's also connected with what are we doing? You probably know that, more than 80% of physical scientists work either for the military or for the industry. That means either for greed or for power or fear.
You're bringing up another theme that you speak on, which is the global situation. You do speak on that global situation regarding both human interaction between humans and with the environment.
Well, you see, if anybody even vaguely interested in wholeness or oneness, if their lifestyle or their attitude does not lead to compassion for the others, including the others, then we're just talking. Then we're just simply Om is equal to MC squared. That's very fine. So let's develop more energy so we can kill the others more easily. Then that will be bringing us to Om. That is the nonsense that I was talking about earlier. Does this attitude reflect in their lives? It's all very fine to talk about non-duality. When they meet somebody, can they actually include them in their perception?
Include them in their perception? You mean perceive them
as part of themselves?
Perceive them as part of themselves. You're talking about perception as perception itself.
Awareness. I mean, as I earlier mentioned, you probably know that there is only one saying of Christ, which you can find in all the 4 canonical Gospels, which is, you have eyes, but you do not see. Ordinary eyes see ordinary things. Spiritual eyes, which is the whole meaning of, if you really have any experience of wholeness, oneness, non-duality, then you at least momentarily see with spiritual eyes. And then you see that the others are just like you. They are not only like you, they are you.
And I imagine, like I said, you talk on a number of themes, but it sounds like right now you're just pointing to a bottom line, probably, perhaps, to everything you talk about.
Yes.
Is that the case?
It is more or less what I usually talk about. In fact, I often ask these people who invite me repeatedly, why do they invite me again? Because I'm always saying really much the same. But I think it's like, if something is nourishing, we don't say, I had lunch 4 days ago, so I don't eat lunch today. We can hear to the same piece of music again and again, or look at the same work of art again and again. So we can hear even the same talk again and again, if it is nourishing at a level which is not just ordinary, passing of time. So people invite me, I suppose, again and again, but I'm really always saying much the same.
Do you feel you're saying the same thing when you're speaking?
Well, sometimes people report to me that they have heard me say the same thing earlier, which is probably true. But when I'm speaking, I wish to speak at that time anyway, from being present to what I'm saying. Then, whether the words are the same or not the same, it doesn't matter. I heard, for example, you may know the name of J. Krishnamurti, very great man, actually.
Yeah, you were kind of friends with him, with Krishnamurti, Jiddu
Yes.
Krishnamurti.
Yes, and I occasionally even have said to my friends that I have heard him so many times, I could more or less complete the sentence he was going to say. That doesn't mean that it is what he's saying is only to do with some sentences, but I still wish to be in his presence, because they're not simply saying something, they are demonstrating a connection with this oneness, with this non-duality. So my hope is that when I speak, I'm not simply saying something. Of course, one is using words, so one has to say something. One can record the words, one can write down, have a transcription of the words. But does it come from some sufficient spiritual depth in me? That is certainly my wish. Does it come from that? I don't know. Others have to judge that.
Others have to judge it. Yeah. You have talked about Krishnamurti and your time spent with him, and you have said, in what I've heard you speak, you've talked about the value of his presence as being most important.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think presence is really what is transforming. The words can be reminders. We can write down the words, we can record them, and possibly, therefore, later on, be reminded of something, and that the memory itself can sometimes reconnect us with the experience. But it's the presence that carries the energy. That is the connecting energy.
Mm-hmm.
No, I've been very fortunate in my life to have met some very remarkable people. Krishnamurti was certainly one of them, but I have met many great Zen masters, and on Mount Athos I met quite remarkable Christian monks. And I have met Madame de Salzman, who was really responsible for the Gurdjieff teaching after the death of Gurdjieff. She was my teacher for, many years.
I'll make the assumption that presence characterizes all of these people. Is the quality of presence different with each person in some way? Does it resonate with you in a different way, each person?
Yes, well, the presence itself has, if you like, many levels, just as the whole spiritual realm has many levels. Very simple reminder, as you know, in the Bible, we have 9 orders of angels between human beings and God. These are all different levels of the spiritual world, which is another thing which I find people sometimes get so carried away with non-duality that they can forget the whole meaning of levels. That it really requires for us to be aware of many, many levels. Even when Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita absolutely invites Arjuna to be very much him, Madhubha, be of my being. That doesn't mean that Arjuna does not have to follow the instructions of Krishna. There is oneness, but also the uniqueness of everybody. This is very important to understand. Otherwise, one just has words like oneness and non-duality. Uniqueness is absolutely an essential aspect of oneness of everything.
An architect named Christopher Alexander.
Yes.
And I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Not very much, but I have heard a talk done by CBC Radio of him. And
he talks about things standing out shining, and they stand out shining when you understand the non-dual aspect or the oneness aspect. And I think that sounds like what you were saying, that things are unique, and he uses the word stands out shining.
Yes. Well, yes, each one of us actually, even though, if I use a semi-traditional language, we may all be coming from God or from Brahma, but each one of us needs to have our own unique song for the praise of God, our own unique way to connect with Brahma, to experience Brahma. to manifest.
People who have this presence, they see, what they see or who they see stands out shining, again, to use Christopher Alexander's words. When I met Jiddu Krishnamurti briefly,
yes.
After a talk, I went just to thank him and, be in his presence. Basically, I really had nothing to say to him.
Yes.
And he was talking to someone, and he sensed I was standing there, and he turned and he faced me, and I'll never forget it. It was as though I was the only thing that existed.
Yeah.
The way I'll never forget his eyes or his bearing.
That's remarkable, isn't it? That somehow the presence can be conveyed. On the other hand, you should also realize some of these teachers, there are many such stories told about Gurdjieff. I never met him personally. He died in 1949. But that sometimes these teachers, as it were, hide themselves. They are there, but they're not visible. They don't stand out because, they don't want to spend their time or energy just wastefully. We have many stories of this, even about Christ, for example. The crowd wishes to crown him the king. At the end of the same chapter in the Gospel, they are willing to kill him, stone him to death. So he just walks away, goes to the other side of the river, goes up the mountain. So these teachers are not always very eager to be in the crowds, So sometimes they hide themselves. They're not so visible.
I want to thank you, Dr. Ravi Ravindra.
I wish you good luck. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your time, Ravi. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.